6 weeks after joining the company, the COO's nephew walked into our operations department as my new boss and immediately started fixing systems he barely understood. I had years of experience, a written warning, and one terrible feeling. He wasn't listening. I had worked in operations at Halcyon Freight Systems for almost 9 years when Ethan Mercer became my boss. He had been with the company for 6 weeks. Ethan was 28, polished, confident, and related to the one person nobody in our department wanted to challenge, the COO. His uncle, Richard Mercer, had introduced him as a strategic operations associate. At first, Ethan mostly observed meetings, reviewed reports, and asked why we used certain vendors or maintained backup freight contracts. Those were fair questions. The problem was how quickly curiosity turned into certainty. By his 4th week, he no longer asked why a system existed. He asked why we were still paying for it. That word told me everything. To Ethan, long experience looked like resistance. Backup capacity looked like waste. Caution looked like fear. Our department handled routing, warehouse capacity, emergency shipping, and vendor contracts. Most days were calm because experienced people had already planned for what could go wrong. Ethan saw only the price of that preparation. Then an internal email arrived. My manager, Linda Cho, was being moved into a new strategic position. It sounded important until you noticed she would no longer control the team she had managed for years. Effective immediately, Ethan would take over daily operations. 6 weeks after joining the company, the COO's nephew was now managing employees with a decade or more of experience. Nobody said nepotism in the meeting room. Nobody needed to. The next morning, Ethan opened his first management presentation with a slide titled, "Doing More with Less." He showed us a list of operational costs and highlighted contingency freight contracts. "These agreements are expensive," he said. "We barely use them." "They guarantee capacity when primary carriers fail," I replied. "We can buy spot capacity if that happens." That answer made me uneasy. Spot capacity sounds simple until a disruption hits and every company in the region is suddenly trying to hire the same trucks. Prices rise, availability disappears. Customers keep waiting. I explained that we had already used those backup contracts during previous outages. Ethan nodded as if he had heard the argument before. "I understand the history," he said, "but we can't keep paying for worst-case scenarios." That isn't a worst-case scenario. It has happened. For a second, the room went silent. Then Ethan smiled. "Send me your concerns in writing." So I did. That afternoon, I emailed him a concise risk assessment. I listed the regions that would lose guaranteed overflow capacity, attached prior incident reports, and explained that cutting those contracts could create serious financial exposure if a primary carrier failed. I copied procurement and Linda. Then I saved the message in our compliance archive, a paper trail. 23 minutes later, Ethan replied, "Thanks, good context. I'm comfortable proceeding with the strategy." No discussion, no additional modeling, no compromise. Just a new boss, a bad business decision, and a written warning sitting quietly in his inbox. At the time, nobody knew whether his cost-cutting plan would ever be tested. But I knew one thing. If something went wrong, he would never be able to say nobody warned him. Ethan moved fast. By the end of the week, 2 contingency freight contracts were canceled, and a third was cut to the minimum. Finance praised the projected savings, and Richard Mercer forwarded the update to senior leadership with a note about decisive operational discipline. For several days, everything worked. Trucks arrived, warehouses stayed on schedule, customers received their shipments. Ethan walked through the department like the numbers had already proven him right. That was the dangerous part. Bad decisions do not always hurt immediately. Sometimes they reward you first. On the 12th day, I arrived before 7 and saw 3 missed calls from our Midwest dispatch coordinator. I called back. "Primary carrier's network is down." "How bad?" "Regional dispatch, tracking, load assignment, everything." "Recovery estimate?" "They don't have one." I opened the carrier portal.
Half the system was frozen. Within minutes, Marcus from procurement was standing beside my desk. Backup capacity? Gone. He closed his eyes for a second. Of course. I called our former contingency vendor.
We lost our reserved allocation when the contract was canceled, I said. What can you give me today? He checked. Spot market only. The quote arrived 10 minutes later, nearly triple our old emergency rate. Ethan walked in carrying coffee. I met him before he reached his office. We have a Midwest carrier failure. He looked at the quote. That can't be right. It is. We never paid anything close to this. We paid for guaranteed capacity. He stared at the screen. Call somebody else. I already am. Over the next hour, I contacted 6 carriers. 2 had no trucks. 3 wanted even higher rates. 1 could help the following week. By 9, the office had changed completely. Phones rang non-stop. Warehouse managers demanded instructions. Customer service teams wanted delivery estimates. Teams messages stacked up faster than anyone could answer them. Ethan called an emergency meeting. We need solutions, he said. Marcus pushed a pricing sheet across the table. These are the available options. Ethan scanned it. This is ridiculous. Marcus stayed calm. This is the spot market during a regional disruption. Ethan looked at me. What if we wait 24 hours? We risk missing customer production windows. And if we pay these rates, we reduce the damage. Reduce? We're already late on several loads. That changed the room. Late was no longer theoretical. By noon, 2 major customers had sent escalation notices. One warned that delayed components could interrupt production the next morning. Finance joined the call. Then legal. Then Richard. His voice came through the speakerphone. How did we get this exposed? Ethan answered quickly. Our primary carrier had an unexpected systems failure. I know what happened to them, Richard said. Why don't we have enough secondary capacity? Nobody spoke. Ethan glanced at me, then back at the phone. We're sourcing emergency options now. Source faster. The call ended. For the rest of the afternoon, we bought whatever capacity we could find. Premium freight, overtime, storage fees, expedited handling, customer penalties. Every solution came with another invoice. At 4:30, Finance sent the first consolidated exposure estimate. Ethan opened it at the conference table. His expression changed immediately. The savings from his cost-cutting plan were already gone, and the customer impact was still being calculated. He closed the spreadsheet. We need to contain this. Nobody answered, because by then, the problem was no longer just operational. It was managerial. Near the end of the day, Linda stopped at my desk. You kept your warning, right? I opened the archived email. Regional exposure, loss of guaranteed capacity, potential penalties, financial risk. Everything had been documented before the contracts were cut. Below it sat Ethan's reply. Thanks, good context. I'm comfortable proceeding with the strategy. Linda read it. Keep that. I will. 10 minutes later, Corporate Risk sent an email requesting contract changes, approval records, supporting analysis, and any written objections submitted before implementation. I looked toward Ethan's office. He was standing completely still. The crisis was no longer asking how many trucks we could find. Now it was asking who had made the decision that left us without them. And the answer was already in writing. If you've ever watched someone ignore experience and learn the hard way, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments, would you have kept that email too? Corporate Risk moved quickly. By the next morning, internal audit, legal, and a representative from the CFO's office had taken over our largest conference room. Their arrival changed the atmosphere immediately. People lowered their voices near the glass walls. Managers stopped making casual jokes, and every conversation suddenly sounded more careful. The first instruction was simple: preserve everything connected to the contingency cuts. Emails, approval records, vendor correspondence, financial models, contract revisions, meeting notes. Nothing could be deleted, altered, or cleaned up. Ethan read the notice twice. Why are they treating this like a major investigation? Marcus looked up from his laptop. Because the loss is major. Ethan ignored him and went back into his office. At 11, audit called me in. Karen Bell, the lead investigator, had a calm voice and a habit of pausing after every answer. She asked how long I had worked in operations, whether I had supported the contract reductions, and whether I had raised concerns before implementation. I gave her the email chain. She read my risk assessment slowly, then opened Ethan's response. Thanks, good context. I'm comfortable proceeding with the strategy. Was there any additional review after this? She asked. Not with me. Were you asked to revise your recommendation? No. Did you believe the decision created significant exposure? Yes. How significant? Significant enough that I documented it before the contracts were changed. Karen nodded and saved the file. No drama, no reaction. That somehow made the meeting feel more serious. When I returned to my desk, Ethan was waiting. What did they ask? About the contracts. And your email? Yes. His expression tightened. You understand there was pressure from leadership to reduce operating costs. I understand that. This wasn't some random decision I made alone. I never said it was. He lowered his voice. But your email makes it look that way. No, my email shows that I warned you about the risk. For a second, he had nothing to say. That was when I realized he was no longer trying to defend the decision itself. He was trying to spread responsibility. By early afternoon, Richard Mercer was called into the conference room. The door stayed closed for more than an hour. When he came out, he walked directly into Ethan's office. Through the glass, I could see the difference immediately. Richard was no longer the supportive uncle who had praised operational discipline. He was an executive, dealing with a problem that now had a dollar sign attached to it. He spoke sharply. Ethan answered. Richard interrupted. At one point, Ethan gestured toward our side of the floor. Marcus noticed. That looks encouraging. I kept working. A few minutes later, finance sent an updated exposure report. The number had grown again. Emergency freight premiums were only part of it. There were customer penalties, warehouse overtime, expedited handling, storage costs, missed service targets, and claims connected to production disruption. One customer submitted a formal request for reimbursement. Then another did the same. The estimated impact crossed several $1,000,000. Suddenly, the office felt colder. Nobody was discussing savings anymore. Ethan's language changed too. The phrases became longer and less specific. He stopped saying, I decided. Now it was, the team evaluated. He stopped saying, my strategy. Now it was, the broader cost initiative. He stopped saying the risks were manageable. Now the carrier failure was an exceptional market event. It was almost impressive how quickly confidence turned into corporate grammar. But the paperwork did not change with his vocabulary. Procurement had the approval trail. Finance had the original forecast. Legal had the contract amendments. I had the warning. And Ethan had answered it himself. Later that afternoon, Karen asked him a direct question during a follow-up interview. The conference room door opened briefly, and I heard her voice from across the floor. Were you aware of these concerns before approving the reductions? Then the door closed. I never heard his response. I did not need to. The timestamp answered for him. Near 4, Linda came downstairs and stopped at my desk. You doing okay? Mostly. You haven't said I told you so once. That wouldn't help. No. She glanced toward Ethan's office. But I suspect several people are thinking it for you. I smiled. Probably. Then another person entered the conference room. HR. That changed the mood again. Finance investigates money. Legal looks at liability. Audit looks at process. When HR joins, the company starts looking at people. Ethan noticed too. His office door stayed closed for nearly an hour, At 5:17, a calendar invitation appeared in my inbox. Executive review. Attendance required. The attendee list included the CFO, legal, audit, HR, Richard, Ethan, Linda, Marcus, and me. That was unusual. People at my level were rarely invited into executive reviews unless leadership needed someone who had seen the decisions before they became consequences. I opened the archived folder again. My warning was there. The attachments were there. Ethan's approval was there. So were the dates. 9 years in operations had taught me that facts are not always loud. Sometimes they just sit quietly in an inbox until someone important finally decides to read them. For weeks, Ethan had treated experience like resistance. Now the company was asking why the person with 6 weeks of experience had ignored the people who knew exactly what could happen. The executive review started at 9 the next morning. By 8:55, everyone was already seated. The CFO sat at the head of the table, with legal and internal audit beside her. HR had a folder open. Richard was across from them. Ethan sat 2 chairs away, unusually quiet. Linda, Marcus, and I took the remaining seats. Nobody offered coffee. That alone told me what kind of meeting this was. The CFO began without small talk. We now have a consolidated estimate of the financial impact associated with the Midwest disruption. She turned the screen on. A spreadsheet appeared. Emergency transportation, customer penalties, production interruption claims, warehouse overtime, expedited handling, storage charges, contractual credits. The numbers ran down the page in neat rows, which somehow made them look worse. Then she scrolled to the bottom. Total estimated impact, $6.4 million. Nobody moved. $6.4 million. Ethan's cost-cutting initiative had been presented as a way to eliminate unnecessary spending. Now the room was staring at a loss large enough to erase those savings many times over. The CFO looked at Ethan. Walk us through the decision. He straightened in his chair. The objective was to reduce underutilized contingency spending while maintaining access to spot market capacity. That was the objective, she said. I'm asking how the decision was made. Ethan paused. We reviewed historical utilization and determined the contracts were being used infrequently. Marcus shifted beside me. The CFO noticed. Mr. Hale? Marcus folded his hands. Frequency wasn't the purpose of those contracts. Guaranteed availability was. Ethan responded immediately. We understood that. The CFO's eyes narrowed. If you understood it, why was guaranteed capacity removed? Silence. Ethan looked toward Richard. Richard did not look back. That small movement told me more than anything either of them had said. Ethan tried again. We believed the exposure was manageable. Karen from Internal Audit opened a document. Before approval, you received a written assessment stating that reducing these agreements would materially increase regional exposure and could lead to significant financial losses. She turned the document toward him. My email. Ethan glanced at it. Yes, but that was one assessment. One from an employee with nearly 9 years in this operation, Karen said. He looked at me. For a moment, I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. Then he changed direction. The broader organization was under pressure to reduce costs. This wasn't something I invented in isolation. Richard finally spoke. There was a company-wide savings target. Ethan nodded quickly. Exactly. Richard continued. There was not a directive to terminate critical contingency coverage. The room became completely still. Ethan turned toward him. You supported the initiative. I supported reducing unnecessary expense. You congratulated the results. Based on the information you presented. That landed hard. For weeks, Ethan had relied on his uncle's position like an invisible safety net. Now Richard was cutting the rope in public. The CFO interrupted before either could continue. This review is not about family discussions or interpretations. It is about documented authority. She looked toward legal. A timeline appeared on the screen. Ethan's proposal, procurement's request for confirmation, my risk assessment, his reply, final authorization, contract cancellation. Every step carried a date and time. There was nowhere for the decision to hide. Karen pointed to the approval record. Mr. Mercer, this is your authorization? Yes. And this response acknowledging the risk assessment is also yours? Yes. Did anyone instruct you to disregard the warning? Ethan hesitated. No. Did you request additional modeling? No. Did you escalate the disagreement to a more experienced operations leader? No. Each answer seemed smaller than the one before it. The CFO leaned back. So we had a known operational risk, a documented warning, and an available escalation process. None of those stopped the change. Nobody answered. There was nothing useful left to say. Then HR asked me a question. Were you ever pressured to withdraw or modify your assessment? No. Were you discouraged from documenting concerns? Not before the decision. Ethan looked up. HR caught it. Afterward? I considered the wording carefully. After the disruption began, Ethan told me my email made it appear that he had acted alone. HR wrote something down. I did not add commentary. I did not need to. That was the strange satisfaction of having a paper trail. You do not have to fight. You do not have to raise your voice. You simply let dates, signatures, and sentences occupy the room. The meeting continued for nearly 2 hours. Finance explained that the $6.4 million figure could still change as customer claims were finalized, but leadership was already treating it as a material management failure. Legal discussed obligations. Audit outlined control gaps. Procurement described how quickly canceled freight capacity had been sold to other customers. By the end, nobody was talking about an unpredictable carrier outage. The outage had triggered the crisis. It had not created the vulnerability. That distinction mattered. When the meeting finally ended, Ethan stayed seated. Richard left without speaking to him. Marcus and I walked back toward operations. Halfway down the hall, he exhaled. $6.4 million. Yeah. All to save what? I looked toward the conference room behind us. Apparently, the wrong thing. Back at my desk, an email from the CFO was waiting. Effective immediately, all major operational cost reductions would require documented risk review and sign-off from an experienced department representative. My name was listed among the people authorized to provide that review. I read the message twice. 9 years of experience had been easy to ignore when it was standing beside a conference table offering a warning. It looked considerably more valuable with $6.4 million attached to the lesson. Across the floor, Ethan stepped out of the executive conference room. He wasn't carrying his laptop. HR was walking beside him.